On April 15, 2020, while most of the world was on lockdown because of the COVID-19 pandemic, the University of Latvia Faculty of Law course, Combating Corruption, had a special guest speaker by video conference, Mr. Adam Smith. Mr. Smith is a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of Gibson, Dunn Crutcher, an international law firm. He received his undergraduate degree from Brown University, a Master's of Philosophy from Oxford University, and a Juris Doctor degree from Harvard Law School. From 2010 to 2015, Mr. Smith served in the Obama administration as the senior advisor to the director of the U.S. Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, and as the director for multilateral affairs on the National Security Council. At OFAC, he played a primary role in all aspects of the agency's work, including briefing congressional and private sector leadership on sanctions matters, shaping executive orders, regulations, and policy guidance for both strengthening sanctions and easing measures, and advising on enforcement actions following sanctions violations. In private practice, Mr. Smith represents companies in sanctions matters. Adam joined the class on April 15 to discuss the application of global Magnitsky Act sanctions in the context of significant instances of corruption.
It is a pleasure to be here. I'd obviously prefer to actually be in Riga, as I'm sure Sean would as well. I've spent quite a bit of time in the Baltics in my life, both as a tourist, quite enjoyably so, and then when I was in the government. I'm also very pleased to be actually speaking to you because it gave me an excuse to put on a suit, which I haven't had to do in a while because we've been working from home for the past month or so. I thought I'd spend just a few minutes to talk about sort of the basics about how sanctions work from a US perspective, and then of course to talk about how they work in particular with respect to the Magnitsky Act, or the Magnitsky Sanctions to be more exact. So in general, and as Sean mentioned, I have a lot of experience. I spent 5+ years working for President Obama at OFAC and at the National Security Council working on sanctions issues. I was one of the sort of leading sort of movers behind trying to impose sort of a global Magnitsky Act under the Obama administration, which didn't happen. But interestingly enough, it happened under the administration of President Trump, which is an interesting strategy, an interesting issue we can talk about as well. But let me step back for a moment and sort of talk about sanctions in general and how they work and why, for instance, the sanctioning of the mayor in Latvia, Mr. Lembergs, why that's relevant, why it matters, why the mayor should be concerned, why the Latvian government responded so quickly with respect to the sanctioning of the Freeport, and sort of explain a little bit about sort of what happened and why it happened. So stepping back, US sanctions are a tool that's been used increasingly over time by administrations in both Republicans and Democrats. They're a tool that's used increasingly primarily because they are very easy to use and their impact is quite significant. And I think it's important to talk about both of those. And maybe I should talk more about the impact first and then talk about why they're so easy to use. So when someone is sanctioned in the United States, what it means, and there are different varieties here, but in general, it means that they are entered into what's called the Specially Designated National List, the SDN list. There are about 7,000 plus names, companies, individuals, et cetera, around the world that are on this list. And what does it mean if you're on this list? Well, quite simply, it means that you are no longer a welcome participant in US finance or US commerce, really. It means that any US person, any US company, any US bank, it is not just illegal for them to engage with you if you were on this list, if Adam Smith was on this list, but it actually means there's potentially criminal liability if you engage with those individuals. It's a pretty serious issue. So you might say, okay, that's no good if you're in the US, but why does it really matter if you're outside the United States? Well, it matters because sanctions not just impact people in the United States, but they also impact people who are engaging in transactions that have a US touch point. What does that mean? It means that a transaction that might flow through the United States would potentially be implicated by sanctions. So why is that relevant? That's relevant because 85–90% of global trade is still done in the US dollar. It means that any transaction involving global finance, the vast majority of it touches the United States. So I'll give you an example. Let's say you're in Riga, you're obviously using the euro and you're selling or buying things to Turkey. which of course uses the lira, the Turkish lira. If you have a transaction that goes from Latvia to Turkey, you might think, well, that goes directly from Latvia to Turkey, and it may well. However, the banking transaction probably doesn't go from Riga to Istanbul. The banking transaction, if it's done in dollars, because if it's a commodity sale, it will likely be priced in dollars, that transaction will likely hit a US correspondent bank. So because the transaction will actually go as follows. It will go from Riga to New York, New York to New York, and then New York to Istanbul. What's happening in New York is the correspondent bank is converting from the euro of Latvia to the lira of Turkey, and it's being converted into dollars. And the way that's being done is through the correspondent system in New York. And the moment a transaction hits New York, naturally it's under US jurisdiction. And because it's under US jurisdiction, that means that anybody who's on the sanctions list, like the mayor, like the Freeport in this context in Latvia, lo and behold, that transaction can't go through. And so if you are on the sanctions list, you as a legal matter can't engage any US transactions, and therefore any transaction that touches New York, even for a second, right? Because these transactions happen very, very quickly, as you might imagine, can't actually go through, and you're sort of outside global finance looking in. That's why people care about sanctions and being sanctioned by the United States as a purely legal matter. Now, one step further, what you're seeing now is increasingly banks around the world are imposing US sanctions or effectively complying with them, even if they don't have to. So most of the big institutions in Europe, many of which of course have representation offices in Latvia, Swedbank, SEB, etc., are complying with US sanctions, even if they don't have to, right? Because the concern is that if you don't comply, even in a pure euro transaction, which doesn't have a US touch point, the next day you may need a US touch point. In other words, a transaction involving Latvia today may just be a euro to euro trade involving Swedbank or SEB or what have you. And that's all fine and good. There's no US jurisdiction there. But if you're a Swedbank, or if you are SEB or any other institution, you know that the following day you may have a transaction that has a US touch point. And your US correspondent, Citibank, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, may ask you a question about whether or not you are fully compliant with US sanctions at all times. You may have to answer no, and therefore you may not be able to engage with your counterparties either. So the impact of being sanctioned is a legal matter is very restrictive for engaging in pure dollar-based transactions. But the reality is that because of the impact of that, people are de-risking and are sort of complying to an even greater extent than you might have to. So the impact of sanctions is both explicitly, as a black letter law matter, explicit and very, very broad. But reality is that it's even broader than it might imagine because of the concerns people have about being sort of caught out cold if you get it wrong. So the impact is significant. And in fact, it's so significant that in some cases, I spent quite a bit of time when I was in government in Latin America, because there are a lot of sanctions in place on narcotics traffickers. And so I spent time in Colombia, in Latin America and South America. And in Colombia, they call being sanctioned, they call it muerte civil, right? Civil death in Spanish, because that's exactly what it is, right? If you're outside global finance, and therefore even outside domestic finance, because banks are so nervous, you can't get a credit card, you can't get a loan, you can't buy a house. The significance is it's really quite an amazingly significant measure. So that's why people care about being sanctioned. That's why the mayor was so upset. That's why the government of Latvia was so upset with respect to the sanctioning of the Freeport, because it happened at the same time, because the view was that the mayor controlled the Freeport. So that's the impact part. So why are they being used, and what does it mean to be used in the US perspective? Well, this is where US sanctions differ in large measure from many other sanctions, including those that Latvia, of course, complies with, both from the EU and the UN. So how is it different? The principal difference that the US has, or the benefit, frankly, the US has, is being able to move very, very quickly for imposing sanctions. Why? Because what the US does to impose sanctions is there is an underlying standing piece of legislation that's actually been in place since 1977. That law is called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, I-E-E-P-A. And what this law lets the president do is look around the world and determine that something, almost anything, frankly, is a, quote, national emergency, and therefore the president is then empowered to impose sanctions with respect to that national emergency. And when I say the president can look around the world and look at anything, I mean that quite literally, because the determination of what is a quote-unquote national emergency, there's no definition of that term. And the courts have long held, more broadly than perhaps you might imagine, that that determination is really for the president to make for his or her own self, on his or her own sort of judgment. The idea being, who better placed than the leader of the United States, the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, the head of the intelligence sort of collection apparatus, which of course the president has in each of those roles, to make that determination. And so the result is that a very broad swath of things, identities, people, even circumstances have been attributed as being national emergencies and therefore been allowed to use the powers of IEPA to impose sanctions very, very quickly. And that's not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. You have issues that are clearly national emergencies, I would argue, the development of nuclear weapons by North Korea, terrorism post 9/11 that have been identified as national emergencies. You also have issues that are very serious, but are perhaps not "quote unquote" national emergencies in the same way, such as human rights violations in Colombia that are sort of have also been identified as national emergencies, but are perhaps less true emergencies in the same way that you might imagine nuclear weapons development or terrorism actually is. And that's actually where Magnitsky comes in. Right, so under the Magnitsky Act, what the president has done, because he's directed to by Congress, which makes life a little difficult, but we can leave that aside for a moment, is he imposed an IEPA-based sanction. And the way you impose these sanctions is by passing what's called an executive order. An executive order is exactly what it sounds like. It's an order signed by the executive, which in this case identifies a national emergency, in this case, significant acts of corruption and significant acts of human rights abuses, which is what Magnitsky covers, and says that anybody who we identify as engaging in corrupt activities, significant acts of corruption, corrupt activities, or significant acts of human rights violations can be sanctioned and be put on that list, and therefore being denied access to the U.S. financial system and then the global financial system for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So that's what he did. Magnitsky Act came online a couple of years ago, and dozens of individuals, dozens of entities have been sanctioned accordingly. Now you might say, okay, that's a pretty significant sort of set of restrictions. What is the basis that the president needs to use in order to put someone on the list? This Mayor Lemberg's, or the Freeport for that matter in Latvia, to give the two perhaps most salient examples for you in Latvia, what does the president need to show in order to put someone on the list? And more to the point, what can someone on the list do if he or she or it, if the company is designated, finds himself or herself or itself sort of wrongly accused? Well, the reality is twofold. And this is where things get very different between the EU and the US. Under the US system, someone can be sanctioned on actually a pretty modest basis of law. Right. So whereas in a criminal system, in order to put someone sort of behind bars, you need to, as the TV shows will tell you, get someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a very high standard, as you might imagine. In a civil system, it's sort of a civil case rather, and where you're trying to sort of sue somebody, for instance, the courts will make a determination, usually the preponderance of the evidence. In other words, more likely than not, which is still a pretty high standard. Under a sanctions basis, what's actually happening is the courts aren't involved at all. It's an administrative decision and not a judicial decision. And therefore, the standard of evidence needed is even lower, right? It's even lower. And in fact, as a legal matter, it's just basically a reasonable belief that the case is met. And that reasonable belief is obviously lower than a preponderance of the evidence and much lower than a reasonable basis, than a beyond a reasonable doubt standard. So unfortunately, it gets even "quote unquote" worse or even more extreme than that. So not only is the standard of evidence needed very, very low in order to get someone on the list, but on top of that, the U.S. can use entirely classified information to get someone on the list. So in other words, an individual can be put on the list solely on the basis of intelligence, on intelligence that that individual may not have access to. So if Adam Smith is a bad actor and I'm engaging in activities that the U.S. deems meritorious of being sanctioned, the U.S. can use solely classified information, in other words, non-public information, to sanction me and put me on that list. And that then, of course, leads directly into the second question of, okay, if I'm put on the list, or the mayor is put on the list, or the Freeport is on the list, what can they do? So what can they do is they can actually file suit, right? Anybody in the world can actually file suit against the US government, and people do, for being put on the list. And it goes to a federal district court here in Washington, D.C., which is where I'm located presently. But the problem with those cases is the first part. In other words, in order to maintain the listing, all that the executive, the president, needs to show is this very modest basis was met. In other words, was there a reasonable basis to believe that Adam Smith is a bad actor? And on top of that, the president can use, as I said, intelligence and its classified sources in order to make that determination. And that classified information, Adam Smith does not get access to. And so that's the problem, right? So as you might imagine, it's very hard to get off the sanctions list. However, you can get off that list. And I think a good demonstration of that is the Freeport situation in Latvia. That Freeport, of course, was put on the list at the same time that Mr. Lemberg was put on the list, because the view was that Mr. Lemberg controlled it. And what the government of Latvia did then is they said, right, we're going to pass a law that basically says that Lemberg no longer controls it. And if he doesn't control it, then we're going to get delisted and removed from that, from being sanctioned. That's exactly what happened, right? So it is certainly true that it's hard to get off the list. There's no question. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. It's a very sticky thing to be on. And even when you get off that list, unfortunately, it can be, there could be a shadow over you with respect to your engagement with banks or otherwise. But the reality is that you still can get off the list, as the Freeport sort of demonstrated. So I think that is sort of the background of sort of both sanctions writ large, which are being used more and more by the US government, and the Magnitsky Act in particular, which of course is a very particular use of sanctions to combat or to sort of respond to significant acts of corruption and significant acts of human rights abuses. And I think it's been a very interesting tool thus far. And I think people have been very impressed, to be honest. And I think it's sort of an odd thing. And one of the reasons I think it's odd is that I think this administration, the Trump administration, quite fairly, I would argue, is not known for one to sort of put human rights issues at the forefront of their foreign policy or national security determinations. And yet they have. And I think the fairest thing to say is that, at least with respect to this particular issue set, they have done a significant amount to put folks who are violating human rights standards and violating corruption standards on sanctions lists, and making their lives very difficult, and making it very difficult for them to engage in sort of further corrupt activities as they are shut out of sort of global financial systems and domestic financial systems writ large. So Sean, is there anything else you sort of want me to sort of begin to discuss as sort of a generalized background matter? I'm happy to do that. I'm happy to sort of obviously answer questions or have discussions. How would you like me to proceed?
Well, I do have a question about the president's executive order, which commenced the global Magnitsky sanctions. My understanding is that while it does rely in part upon Magnitsky, it also relies upon IEPA and the National Immigration Act, so that it really, with a combination of multiple sources of authority, the executive order is actually a bit broader than the Magnitsky Act itself.
That's correct, and it can be, right? So what IEPA, that underlying law I mentioned back from 1977, allows the president to do is that it literally choose anything in order to impose sanctions. And so a sanctions act, a sanctions executive order, can be significantly broader than you might think it should be. And here, what had happened is that Congress had passed a law directing the president essentially to impose Magnitsky, global Magnitsky sanctions, and the way the president implemented it is through this executive order, which was broader in some respects than the Magnitsky Act even requested it to be, which is another reason I think people were somewhat surprised by the breadth of this act. But that's exactly right. It is broader because it can be. And so the Immigration Act that it's also based upon is a similarly broad scope from an executive action perspective, and there's very few people that can question that or challenge the president's authority to impose sanctions on that basis either. With respect to immigration, in other words, the ability to control the borders, which is what immigration really is, the president's authority, the executive authority is very, very, not absolute by any means, but certainly at its height. And sanctions are similarly so. The president can choose to do with the sanctions tool almost whatever he or she sort of opts to do.
So to take an example from the Magnitsky text, I believe the statute refers to granting the president authority to impose the sanctions for significant acts of corruption and gross violations of human rights.
Mhm.
And yet I believe that the executive order omits those adjectives, gross and significant. Could be wrong about that, but it strikes me that this was a sort of a turbocharged sort of executive order that that is stronger than many people would have expected. And I'm just wondering if you have any insight into how it is that this how it is that things came to be as they are through the political process with, as you say, a president who's not known for his concern about human rights or public corruption.
It's a great question. And to be honest, I'm not sure I have a good answer because you're 100% right that there is this sort of interesting dichotomy here with a president that does not, or at least has not appeared to be particularly concerned about these issues as a principal motivator behind his foreign policy at any rate. And yet, arguably, this executive order was done and President Obama didn't do it, right? So there could have been a President Obama version of this, which perhaps would have been more in keeping with the views of the president's and that administration's thinking about corruption and human rights, and it didn't. And so it's not entirely clear. In fact, friends of mine from the Obama administration, one in particular, who's become very active in this space more recently, wrote an article about just that, sort of congratulating Trump and sort of scratching his head about it's not entirely clear why this is the case. Now, it's certainly true that if you do think about corruption issues from a pure business perspective, corruption is bad business, right? And so it increases costs where they shouldn't be, and it transfers costs to places, to people that don't deserve those transfer payments. And so it is sort of bad business to engage in corruption. So from a pure sort of almost Machiavellian approach, if you are a businessman president and you are concerned about international business and you're concerned about the US being able to have sort of an even playing field more broadly, then you are going to want to impose these sanctions globally so that you can be on an even playing field. Because of course the US has a law, as I'm sure you've learned about, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which actually came around in 1977 as well. These were all post-Watergate sort of good government sort of moves, and we can talk about how the sanctions piece fits into that. But broadly speaking, these were all sort of post-Watergate sort of structures. And so the FCPA has been around for 40 years. It's been very active, very aggressive. There are career prosecutors at the Department of Justice that work these issues all the time. And so US companies and those that list in the United States are under a huge amount of pressure to not be corrupt. And if you're in a jurisdiction in other parts of the world where they have less concerns about these, or fewer concerns at any rate, the reality is that US companies, or those that have to comply with the FCPA, are under sort of more greater strictures to engage in free exercise of their sort of commercial interests than those who are less concerned about these issues. So one could argue this is a leveling exercise to bring every company into the same, every company in every country into the same space as US companies have to face. Human rights issue might be a slightly different sort of rationale, but the issue there, of course, is that I think it's very hard. It's sort of an easy win because obviously, significant human rights abuses, there are very few companies or countries or individuals around the world that could find fault in sanctioning people for, pretty atrocious activities. So I think that's sort of an easier sort of political sort of game you could sort of play there as well, that it's just an easy win. Why not sort of do that and get some surprising folks like in the human rights community on your side, as under the Trump administration, which of course would be strange otherwise.
Thank you. I just have one more question before I'd like to turn it over to the students to see if they have questions. And my question relates to the fact that obviously some bad actors make it onto the list of SDRs or SDPs, and some don't. How is it that a bad actor comes to the attention of the US president and ends up on this list versus someone who does not?
So that's a great question. And I think the most important thing to underline there is just what you said, is that some bad actors end up on lists and others do not. And in fact, that's true of every single sanctions program. In other words, there are sanctions programs, for instance, that target narcotics traffickers, as I mentioned, with a focus geographically, historically on Latin America for obvious reasons. That does not mean every single narcotics trafficker is on the sanctions list. And that's a function of two things. One, of course, is resources. OFAC, the agency that does this work, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, is a tiny agency, compared to others. Less than 200 people, or about 200 people rather, globally work these issues. And there's just not the resources to engage in every single narcotics trafficker listing. Similarly, not every single corrupt person or not every single human rights violator. And that goes to the second issue. So who is actually chosen? What you've got to remember about sanctions and about sort of OFAC in general is that we're not really dealing with law. We're dealing with policy, and in particular, foreign policy. So I sort of joke a little bit that I'm a sanctions lawyer in general, which I am, but I don't really practice much law because there's very little law actually here. Because at the end of the day, it is completely discretionary, and I would argue arbitrary, and I think OFAC would agree with this, as to who gets on the list and who doesn't. So are there people who are more corrupt than the mayor in Latvia who was sanctioned? Absolutely. Are there people that arguably should be on the list and deserve to be on the list even more so than he does? Perhaps. But the point is that you've got to remember that there are foreign policy issues that actually guide this decision making more than anything else. This is not an exercise of justice in the same way that you might imagine. It is a foreign policy exercise that allows the president to move towards foreign policy goals by using sanctions as one of these tools. And so the short answer for how people like this get on the list when others do not is just that, is that Latvia is an important actor, NATO member, EU member, obviously frontier state with a challenging jurisdiction like Russia, that we want to make sure, from the US government perspective, is on the up and up. Because at the end of the day, if Russia sees Latvia as sort of as an easy way in to the euro and therefore easy way into global finance, that's going to be a problem for the US and arguably our allies throughout Europe and maybe even more globally. And so Latvia, as I'm sure you know, the reason I'm familiar with Latvia as a professional matter is because Latvia has been under the microscope for quite some time with respect to engagement with Russia, with respect to corruption allegations and all the rest. And so it's not surprising that Latvia sort of received attention from Magnitsky, even when other jurisdictions, other people, other countries, other companies perhaps receive less attention. Because at the end of the day, Latvia is more important in this particular issue than other countries are, and that's where the resources and the diplomatic effort of the US government are going to be sort of expended. So that's really the short answer. Obviously, every case is going to be different. The way these cases are built, just to give you a sense of this also, is that, as I mentioned, the level of evidence needed is very low, but it still exists. And so what OFAC does, there's a whole unit at OFAC called the targeting team. They target, they decide who, they build up packages or dossiers with respect to individuals or entities that deserve to be on the list. They start with the executive order and they say, okay, we're looking for someone who is engaged in corruption under the language of the executive order. Who are these people? And then they can use, as I said, open sources and intelligence sources to build up these packages. And the packages can take many, many months or longer to build. And they basically are composed of raw information, often open source, to be honest. In other words, newspaper articles, perhaps interviews, maybe intelligence sources as well, that they then compile into a sort of a overarching memorandum, which they then append to these documents, that they gets approved by the legal team at OFAC and often the Department of Justice as well, making a determination that the standard, be it limited, is met, and that it then goes to OFAC, the director who signs it, and then that's a designation, that's sanctioned, that's how you sanction the individual. But again, it's a function of the foreign policy interests and national security interests of the US government with respect to who deserves to be sanctioned and frankly who doesn't deserve to be sanctioned. Or more to the point, it's not who deserves to be, who merits the attention and the resources of the US government to impose sanctions on, and who might not merit the same attention.
Thank you very much. Adam, I know, quarantine aside, you're still a busy man. Do you have a few minutes for 3 or 4 questions from?
Absolutely. I've set aside quite a bit of time, so I'm happy to take as many questions as there are.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, If there's anyone among the attendees who would like to ask a question, could you please enter your question into the chat box? And I'm not sure if Adam can see that or not, but if not,
Yeah, I'm not sure I'll be able to, so I'll ask you to read it to me if not.
I'll be happy to do that.
Yeah.
Are there any questions? Okay, there's one that has just appeared. This is from Joris. He asks, don't you think using sanctions broadly and casually, even if that is just an impression, incentivizes states worldwide to build financial systems disconnected or independent from the United States?
100% true. There's no question that that is a risk of sanctions. And frankly, people are starting to think about that more and more. And you're seeing that, actually. You've already seen China and Russia, for instance, develop sort of trading and clearing mechanisms that are completely independent from the US. The problem, though, is twofold, as I see it. First of all, and perhaps most significantly, the sheer weight of the US dollar and therefore the US system in global finance is really quite unrivaled. As I said, 85% plus of global trade is still done in the dollar. So it's certainly possible, even today, it's possible to engage in transactions that have nothing to do with the US at all. The problem, though, as I mentioned, is not just whether a particular trade engages with the US, but whether the trade tomorrow might. So you have a bank that decides to only engage in renminbi trading or ruble trading, for instance, today, which has no US touch point at all. But if their trade tomorrow has to do with the United States, they may find that their correspondent in New York may be unwilling to engage with them. So in some respects, it's a network problem, right? You sort of need everybody to switch at the same time away from the dollar for that to be effective. And the reality is that people thus far are unwilling to do so. And the other reason I think people are, the challenge to move away from the dollar is not just the weight of the dollar and the fact that the system, not through any law of the universe, but rather just because of momentum and otherwise is structured around Lower Manhattan, frankly, is because it's not clear to me that there are ready alternatives that have exactly the same benefits of using the US dollar. So it's certainly true that you could do a trade renminbi-based or ruble-based without much difficulty and have no US touch point at all. But you've got to remember that the pipes, the financial pipes that run through the United States have not just the physical components of being able to run through the United States, but there are some really beneficial institutional structures on top of that that give comfort and certainty with respect to parties that are engaging in those transactions. Put another way, when things go awry, as they often do in global finance, what rights are being protected and by whom? If things go awry in New York, for instance, there is a court system. There is a precedential system, and there's a structure in place whereby your rights, likely property rights, contract rights, can be protected, or at least you'd get a fair hearing. The same may not be able to be said in places like Russia, in places like China, where if you're engaging in a transaction that's purely ruble-based or purely renminbi-based, and things go badly, will the courts in China, will the courts in Russia be able to afford you the same rights, the same predictability of rights, perhaps more to the point, that you get in the United States? So it's the combination of sort of the structure that sort of that makes it difficult to overcome because of the importance of the US dollar, and then of course the other components on top of the US dollar that give people comfort and certainty with respect to using that system that frankly just there's not a match yet for. That doesn't mean there won't be. It doesn't mean that people won't figure out a way to do this. It doesn't mean increasingly there won't be sort of resorts to cyber currency, cryptocurrencies, these sorts of things, which is all true. But again, for global finance that is really very concerned not just about getting the deal through, but about protecting themselves if things go badly, there as of yet is not a similar system, legal structures in place, institutional structures, predictable structures in any other jurisdiction, frankly, other than the United States. So it's the match of the amount, right? Some jurisdictions have one or the other, right? So the euro obviously has a significant sort of institutional basis whereby investor rights can be protected, no question, but they don't have the same depth of financial flows as the US does. Similarly, one could argue that in parts of the world, the renminbi, the Chinese currency, has significant flows, right? Think about Southeast Asia, South Asia, where there's a huge amount of China currency flows and China-based clearing of trade. Very true, but they don't have the institutional structure. So there are many places that have one or the other, but the U.S. thus far, and I say this is a temporal component, right? This will change over time, almost certainly. Does not yet have any competitor in the same way as having both the institutional structure and the depth of trading and expertise that you see in New York.
Thank you very much. Does anyone else have questions?
I think I see a few more.
Okay. Yes. This is from Yekaterina. Adam, thank you for informative lecture. Referring to the Lemberg situation, the FCMC, the local bank supervising authority, has issued the changes in the local law which allows banks to provide him financial services as far as the connected social necessities are concerned, salary, pensions, etc. How is this regulation in compliance with OFAC? Is it okay to process the sanctioned person's payments as far as they are not in the U.S. jurisdiction? Is it possible to be fined by OFAC in this situation?
So there are two things there. So first of all, that allowance, in other words, the allowance for a sanctioned person to have access to blocked or frozen assets for the purposes of maintenance, essentially, salaries, rent, food, etc. That's a very common allowance that you see in the EU and you see in the UN sanction systems. The US doesn't actually, US often allows that as a practical matter. There are exemptions, but as a general rule, sanctions don't automatically include that. In other words, the US has to allow those sorts of exemptions. So you might think, okay, so these transactions that the bank regulator is allowing are not OFAC compliant. And they might not be. However, remember, OFAC jurisdiction only extends with respect to US persons and any transaction that has a US touch point. So if you're engaging in dollar-based transactions, they likely will have a US touch point, and therefore you would need to come under OFAC compliance in order to remain free of the risk of being fined or otherwise. These transactions, I'm guessing, are purely euro-based, right? They're local transactions in which euro-based accounts are being used in order to fund salaries, etc. Therefore, there's no US jurisdiction. Now, it's certainly possible OFAC could get angry and could decide to sanction people, banks or otherwise, for engaging in what's called material support or materially assisting someone who is sanctioned. And that's possible. But remember, that's not a legal issue. That becomes a foreign policy issue, right? Because the sanctioning of individuals rather than the enforcement of sanctions is not a legal matter, but a foreign policy matter. And I would argue that it seems highly unlikely that they would sanction somebody for foreign policy reasons for engaging in activities like maintenance, housing, food, salaries, etc. So the short answer is that there's no US jurisdiction, and the likelihood of the US responding negatively to that, I think, is also very low, although not zero. As I mentioned, the foreign policy component of sanctions allows the US government essentially to do what it pleases in this regard, with very limited ability for anyone to sort of stop them if they really chose to engage.
Thanks for the answer, Adam. Christops has a question. Is there any way for a natural person who happens to be on any of the sanctions lists to get out of the sanctions list through cooperation with OFAC or the US in general, or is the only way through court?
So it's a great question. So there are two ways, in addition to a judicial system, a judicial sort of action to sort of get out of being sanctioned. The first one, of course, is an administrative action where you basically don't engage the court, but rather you engage OFAC, and you sort of there's a process within their regulations that basically ask for reconsideration of their determination. That's actually related then to the second or the third way you can get out of the sanctions, because the only way OFAC will reconsider is if the reasoning behind you being sanctioned has changed. And this actually goes to a fundamental point about sanctions that's important to remember. Sanctions in the US government perspective are not actually punitive measures. As I said, they're not judicial measures, they're administrative measures. And so the goal of sanctions actually is not to punish for past activities, but rather to change behavior on a going forward basis. So the way you get out of sanctions is by demonstrating that your behavior, the reason behind your original sanctioning, is no longer the case. In other words, you are no longer corrupt, you're no longer a narcotics trafficker, et cetera, et cetera. And people do get delisted all the time. Again, perfect example is the Freeport. Why was the Freeport in Latvia, why was it sanctioned? It was sanctioned because it was owned or controlled by someone that the US government deemed to be an oligarch and someone who was himself sanctioned. What the Latvian government did is they didn't go to court with the US, they basically decided to cooperate, as you said. And the way they cooperated wasn't by sort of giving up the goods and anything, but rather was by restructuring the port so that it was no longer owned or controlled by someone who was sanctioned. And that was sufficient from a US government perspective to remove that entity from the list. So again, it is certainly true that if you're on the sanctions list, it's not a good place to be, and it's very, very sticky. It's hard to get off that list, but people do get off the list. And what's interesting about this administration also, which is unique, and you never saw this under the Obama administration or prior administrations, is that it's very common nowadays for the Treasury Department to announce sanctions and at the same time, in the same news conference or the same news press release, say that sanctions are not designed to be permanent. And we are looking for ways to delist or remove entities or individuals from the sanctions list if their behavior changes in accordance. And so that's the way to do this. And so the way you get off the sanctions list, again, difficult though it may be, even if you are changing your behavior, is to demonstrate that your behavior is different and the rationale behind your being sanctioned is no longer the case. And this, again, is a very unique situation in that the Trump administration has made it very clear that this is a part of the sanctions process. In other words, the delisting part is a part of the sanctions because it's a victory for sanctions and the tool of sanctions if the behavior for which someone was sanctioned is no longer taking place. Now, stepping back for one moment, one of the reasons the US government, I think, has come to this conclusion that they need to talk about delisting is that until 2014 or so, when the Russia sanctions came into effect because of the Ukraine and Crimea matter, the US sanctions were principally targeted on sort of economically less important actors, right? In places like Iran, which was large-ish, but not from a global perspective, but Cuba, North Korea, Syria, Zimbabwe, places that are important maybe locally, but certainly not international actors in the same way that Russia was. Russia is a real G8 economy, and obviously impacting directly the jurisdictions in which the U.S. has very significant interests, like the Baltics. And so what the U.S. had to do when they were imposing sanctions is be very, very ginger and sort of careful about who they were imposing sanctions against, but also make it clear in order to limit the collateral consequences of such measures, which would almost necessarily fall very harshly on our allies close to Russia, is make it clear this is how sanctions can be removed. And the idea is twofold, I think. One was to limit the collateral consequences during the sanctions, and then, of course, to allow the ability to remove sanctions entirely once the behavior had changed and therefore reduce collateral consequences entirely. Because obviously the collateral consequences for Russia being sanctioned for the Baltics, for example, let alone for broader Eastern Europe, was significant and significantly greater than it was on the United States. And so that's sort of why they did that. So yes, the short answer to your question is that there's certainly ways to get out of being sanctioned, and the US is sort of more and more encouraging that, albeit still rather difficult to do so.
Thanks again. Are there other questions? Yes, just a second, I'll read this one. Why did it take such a long time from a policy point of view to implement the Magnitsky Act, since the reason for this, I think she's referring to the Lemberg's actions, occurred more than 10 years ago?
Are you talking about the Lemberg action, or are you talking about the Sergei Magnitsky issue? Because you're right. So the reasoning behind the Magnitsky Act actually goes all the way back to the Sergei Magnitsky Act, which was a much more limited Magnitsky Act that was passed back in 2011, I believe. I think that's right. That imposed similar sanctions, but solely on Russian actors associated with the human rights abuses that led to Sergei Magnitsky's death at the hands of sort of the Russian authorities. And that occurred even before then. So I think you're right. It probably was about a decade of activities that led that prior to the sanctions sort of being put into place. And so I think that's what we're talking about. But if you are talking about the Lemberg's issue, we can talk about that as well. I mean, there's no good reason to explain the delay other than the fact that the policymaking process can be quite slow. And the other piece of this, which is interesting, and I frankly find this somewhat curious as well, is that the executive, certainly under President Obama, was very worried about sort of using sanctions too much. And so there was sort of a concern about overuse of sanctions that led, I think, to some people in the administration's concern about imposing a Magnitsky-style sort of global sanctions regime that covered human rights or corruption or some combination of that. And it was then only because Congress forced the president's hand and said, you will impose sanctions on this basis, that the president didn't really have a choice. And in fact, that might be useful as a law faculty. It might be a good sort of way to sort of talk to you a little bit about the way sanctions work as a legal matter, just so we make sure we're on the same page, and why this works the way it does. So in the U.S. system, you have a hierarchy of authorities, right? You of course have the Constitution at the top, which are very sort of abstract principles in a way. And the Constitution is then implemented via laws, and laws are written by Congress. And so Constitution comes on top, and then comes the laws. But the way the laws are actually structured, and the way we as individuals or companies actually interrelate with the laws, is not through the laws themselves, usually, but rather through regulations. And so what happens is the laws are passed, and then the executive branch imposes regulations that implement the laws. And so what sanctions are, to think about it in this way, are actually the regulations. What sanctions actually do through an executive order is they ask elements of the executive branch, like the Treasury Department, to write a regulation, right, under this law, IEPA, which I mentioned, to impose sanctions of the sort the president has asked. And so what we're talking about here is that the president could have always written an executive order, any president, to impose human rights sanctions or corruption sanctions if he had so chosen. President Obama, President Bush, President Trump, whoever. But because executive orders come below the law, the Congress, if Congress passes a law, the president has to follow it. And so what happened here is that the president may have not wanted to impose on his own volition sanctions imposing for corruption. But once Congress got around to passing a law, he had to write this executive order to comply with that legal structure. Because again, the structure is Constitution, law, regulations. And so that's sort of what happened here. The executive order directs the imposition of regulations. So there's no excuse other than to say that our system is very complicated and can take a long time to go from sort of stimulus with respect to a human rights violation or otherwise, and response, a law that requires the imposition of penalties, sanctions, immigration restrictions on that basis.
Great, thank you. Any further questions? Maybe I have one quick one while we wait to see if there are any further student questions. And that is, if you look at the judicial procedures that are available for challenging being added to a sanctions list, could you give us any kind of indication as to the success ratio, how likely it is if you go to court to contest being placed on the sanctions list, how likely is it that you will get relief from the court?
Low. I think the fairest answer is low. And the reason for that, as I said, is twofold. One is that in order to remain on the list, in other words, what does the government need to show in order to win in a case like that? Remember, all the government needs to show is that they had a reasonable basis to believe that you or this company belongs on this list because you, in the language of the Magnitsky Act, for instance, you were engaged in activities involving corruption, right? Responsible for or complicit in, directly or indirectly, in corruption, which is the language from this executive order. In other words, you don't need to show beyond a reasonable doubt. You don't need to show by preponderance of the evidence. All you need to show is you had a reasonable basis to make that conclusion. And so that's the first reason. In other words, the deference that the courts are giving the executive in this regard is significant. And it's even more than that, as I mentioned, because of the potential availability of classified information, meaning that you can demonstrate that reasonable basis, not just because you read about it in the London Times or in the Wall Street Journal, but which everyone can see, obviously, and you could challenge as being not true if you were the target of this. but based upon intelligence, based upon classified information provided not just through US sources, but through allied sources, through Europe, through Latvia, what have you, that provide further comfort that this individual, this entity, has a reasonable basis to be on this list. And so the result is that it's very challenging to get off this list. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. There are some cases where the courts have said that the evidence provided is not sufficient. And therefore you should be taken off the list. OFAC usually responds not by engaging that issue, but rather by just taking someone off the list. In other words, they don't want even more bad law to be found, and so they sort of moot the argument by basically taking someone off the list, which has happened a couple of times. Now, the comparison here with the EU system is actually pretty important. In the EU system, first of all, a sanction is viewed as more of a judicial measure than an administrative measure, and is therefore viewed more as a deprivation of rights that can receive judicial redress than in the United States. And that's for an interesting legal fiction. In the United States, if someone is sanctioned because it's not a judicial act, their property may well be frozen, right? Their ability to engage in the US system, for instance, and their actual bank accounts in the United States may well be frozen, but they actually still own that property. They still have the property right, the title they still have. And so there's this legal fiction that because their property has not been deprived, they haven't been taken away, they don't need a higher standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, preponderance of the evidence that would necessarily be required in order to actually seize or forfeit that property. In Europe, that's not how they view the world. They view sanctions in two different important ways. One is they view a sanction usually as a potential deprivation of property that can receive judicial redress. And two, they don't buy usually the ability for countries to use classified information as the basis, sole or otherwise, to sanction individuals. And so the result has been, and we can talk about why this is so, the result has been a pretty steady stream in the European Union of delisting. In other words, people who are sanctioned in the US often then become sanctioned in the EU. The EU has turned around and delisted many people over the course of the past decade because of this absence of availability of information, often in the terrorism context where there's a lot of intelligence-based designations. People have been delisted because the European courts, all the way up to the ECJ, have decided that it wasn't sufficient enough to just tell someone, we have classified information and therefore you need to be sanctioned. So that's sort of, in the US, it's very hard to be delisted. In Europe, it's hard too. I don't mean to suggest otherwise, but the standards are different, so that if you are sanctioned on the basis of classified information that you can't get, your likelihood of being delisted actually might be higher in Europe than certainly in the United States.
Thank you. We have two more questions on the line. You still have time, Adam?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Great, and maybe after these two, we can take one more. So somebody else, if you want to raise a question, now's the time to do it. But I'll read next a question from Andres. How can the U.S. OFAC be sure that, for example, the same Lembergs is not controlling the Freeport in the shadows? Does Latvia's government somehow guarantee that?
It's a great question, and this is another reason why it's often hard to be delisted, right? Because what OFAC doesn't want to do, or the US government doesn't want to do, is delist someone or something only to find that activity, that behavior that has been changed, actually didn't change, because as you said, someone is running this in the shadows, or their nominee is running it, or otherwise. And so every case is going to be different. But I can assure you, in the Freeport case, I mean, I'm not in the government now, but I'm fairly confident what happened is that the Latvian government, likely with the assistance of the EU itself in Brussels, basically gave them some comfort that this was not going to happen. So they passed the law. I'm guessing the embassy in Riga, the US embassy in Riga, is sort of checking in on this. And I'm sure the EU also gave their guarantee to the US. So is it possible that Lemberg or his friend or his wife, his children, what have you, aren't still sort of pulling the strings? Of course it's possible. But I think the US was given assurances that were comfortable enough for them to delist. The other piece I'm guessing that happened is the government of Latvia basically said to the United States, we will try to make you comfortable, but you should know that this sanction has huge geopolitical and economic effects on Latvia, your ally. And so your treaty ally under NATO. And so I think the US decided that the combination of the impact of this designation, which of course the Latvian people weren't the target of this designation, so the impact could have been significant in that regard, and the assurances the Latvian government and the EU likely gave the US, gave them enough comfort to delist. And I'm guessing the other risk here for Latvia and the EU is that there's nothing stopping OFAC from relisting if things go awry. And so I think the biggest check on Lemberg and others still engaging in this ownership or control of the port is that Latvia would not want this entity to be relisted, which of course could happen very quickly. So I think that's the other piece of it.
Thank you. Question from Yekaterina, who asks, can an OFAC decision putting Lembergs on a sanctions list become evidence in lawsuits against Lembergs in Latvia? Do you know any situation when OFAC sanctions became a reason a person was found guilty of corruption charges, presumably in their home country?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think what you're referring to, I think, or at least perhaps positing, is that given that the standard of evidence is so quote unquote limited, would it be unfair to use that determination as a basis of guilt in other legal systems? And I think you're right. I think it would be unfair, potentially, depending on the quality of the evidence that's available. I mean, for instance, in the Lemberg case, even though it's certainly true that the level of evidence needed is very modest, the reality is that OFAC, for its own sake and others, and I think for good government's sake, very rarely likes to only just meet that evidence. It likes to far exceed that evidence, maybe not up to the level of beyond a reasonable doubt, but certainly closer and closer to preponderance of the evidence, if not higher. And so I think you're right. I think that it would be unfair to just have the mere basis of someone's guilt in another jurisdiction, the fact that they're sanctioned. I think that would be a perversion of the idea behind why sanctions are imposed. But I think that it's certainly possible to use the evidence that may well be open source and public as a basis for designation. That were used as a basis for designation as a basis for guilt in another jurisdiction. I honestly can't think of a case in which guilt has been ascribed on the basis of a U.S. sanction in another jurisdiction. It may well have happened, but I can't think of one. Certainly, other things happen a lot that you see. For instance, contracts fall into force majeure. In other words, certain companies around the world, even outside the United States, decide to stop dealing with parties who are sanctioned under force majeure provisions or otherwise because sanctions are just too difficult for them to sort of engage with. So it's more than just Lemberg being sanctioned or the Freeport being sanctioned. I'm guessing no shipping company, no insurance company, no port authority would want to have anything to do with this, with the Freeport while it was being sanctioned. In other words, the impact of the designation, the impact of Mr. Lemberg's sanctions are greater than just on Mr. Lemberg, and there are other sort of legal consequences that can flow and be triggered from this designation, and I think that happens all the time. I can't think of a criminal matter that it was just decided solely on the basis of someone being designated, although I don't put it outside the realm of possibility. It may well have happened. But I think most people in the U.S. and OFAC especially would argue that that's not really the purpose of a designation if that's how it's being used.
Thank you. Guntra is asking, please comment on the 50% rule, and I believe here she's referring to ownership and control.
That's right.
For example, in Latvia, there are some companies where Mr. Lembergs is stated as one of the beneficiaries, and these are not placed on the OFAC list. How should we look to possible sanctions with these companies?
That's a great question. 50% rule is a very aggressive interpretation that the U.S. has used with respect to extending the impact of a sanction. So the way the 50% rule works, and I'm guessing the questioner is well aware of this, but just to make sure everyone's on the same page, is that an individual like Mr. Lemberg that's put on the sanctions list is obviously treated as sanctioned. However, if Mr. Lemberg is found to own 50% or more of any other entity, company or otherwise, that entity is treated or needs to be treated as though it is sanctioned as well, even if it's not listed on the sanctions list, which some could argue is rather unfair, because especially in situations and jurisdictions where there's opaque ownership structures with respect to who's a beneficial owner and there's shell companies and everything else, how are you supposed to know that Mr. Lemberg directly or indirectly owns 50% or more of a particular company? And it's challenging. And I think OFAC is well aware of that. But that's right. And so what you're going to have always for companies, for individuals like Mr. Lemberg, is you can have situations in which he is designated, and he may well, because of his years of power, his years of being a wealthy man, have structured his companies in such a way to make it difficult who owns 50% or more of a particular company. And the way the 50% rule works is that if he owns less than 50%, that entity is not sanctioned. It's not restricted in the same way. And so what you do see in much of the world, certainly sophisticated parts of the world, Latvia, Russia, etc., is a desire by those who are sanctioned to reduce their holdings of particular companies to below the 50% threshold. Because if it's below 50%, there's no restrictions. It's just sort of the OFAC advises to be careful of engaging with companies like that. It is not a prohibited activity to engage with companies like that. So that's right. I mean, so any company in which Mr. Lemberg may be a beneficial owner of may well be restricted if his ownership is more than 50%, but it may not be, right? And my gut is that given who he is and his sophistication, I'm guessing he has structured his affairs to make it difficult to see and maybe no longer true if he has 50% of these ownerships. He may be a beneficial owner of a company or an entity, but so long as it's below the 50% threshold, there's no OFAC restrictions explicitly on that entity.
Great explanation. Thank you. Adam, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
This has been so informative to get this directly from someone who has been involved both in the policy formulation and in enforcement and representing companies that are on the receiving end of these sanctions. So we really appreciate that.
My pleasure. My pleasure. It's a real treat, and I hope one day soon I actually get to come to Riga and speak to everyone in person.
That makes two of us.
Indeed, indeed, indeed.